Amen. Thank you, men of hope. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is where we are, verses 1 through 13. Now, verse number 12 of our text really sums up the overarching lesson that is comprised in these verses. So look at verse 12 with me of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where verse number 12 reads as follows: "Wherefore, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." The word wherefore in verse number 12 refers back to the example of the Old Testament Israelites that Paul is describing for us in verses 1 through 11. The problem that the Israelites suffered from was a case of overconfidence. They took God's blessings for granted, and they saw themselves as bulletproof. God's blessings are never, ever the problem. Only how we respond to God's blessings can be the problem. The problem is when you see yourself as being unstoppable, when you see yourself as being unsinkable, when you take for granted that you will never go too far, and you take for granted that God is going to bless you no matter what. See, here's the problem with playing with fire and just so happening to not get burned. If you choose to play with fire, and sure enough, you don't get burned, you're going to become overconfident the next time, and it will be far worse. Like someone who tests his limits to see how much fire can I play with without getting burned. Every time you do it and get more confident, you'll be playing with more and more hotter fire. And then when you finally do, because of your overconfidence, because you tested those limits, it's going to be far, far worse for you. So also, the Israelites, they tested God's limits and wanted to see what they could get away with. Many Christians today, and every day since, do the exact same thing. They test God's limits. They see how close they can get to sin without technically sinning. And then, you know where that leads? First, you see how close you can get to the line of sin without actually sinning until you cross the line. Then after that, you're seeing how much sin you can commit before it catches up with you. Take, for example, movies. When it comes to movies, I cannot give you the exact standards of what movies are or are not okay to watch. That, to some extent, would fall within the periphery of your individual Christian liberty. I cannot draw that exact line for you. But I can say this about bad movies. You might be someone who would think to yourself, "Oh, I would never, ever watch pornography." You might think that you would never, ever do that. But a lot of what passes today as mainstream movies and mainstream television is nothing more than porn light. And you're playing with fire, and you'll end up watching pornography. If you push that envelope, seeing how close you can get, you're testing God and you're overconfident. You're going to end up where you planned on never going. You know, no man anywhere just wakes up one morning and out of the blue says, I think I'll cheat on my wife today. No man just gets up and does that out of the blue, but it doesn't come out of the blue. First, he allows that little flirtation with that pretty coworker. He allows what he tells himself is just a harmless, innocent little flirtation to happen. And then, once he goes there, he won't hesitate to do so again tomorrow, because he tells himself, oh, I would never cheat on my wife. That man is overconfident. And that's why verse 12 says, let him that thinketh he standeth, oh, I'm standing, I'm strong, I'll never fall, take heed lest he fall. My Christian brothers and sisters, do not ever take victory for granted. You know, one of Paul's absolute favorite illustrations that he uses throughout his epistles is the illustration of the ancient Greek Olympic Games, which were very popular in his day and time. It was an illustration all of his readers could relate to. The Apostle Paul ends chapter number 9 with a reference to the ancient Olympic Games and says that the Christian life is a lot like a race. It's like a race in a couple of ways. One is that victory is going to take constant discipline. And number two, it will exhaust you. You see, salvation is free, but being a Christian who makes a difference for God is no more free than is a gold medal at the Olympics. All believers get into heaven for free. But if you want Christ to place a gold medal around your neck, then you're going to have to be a disciplined, sacrificial, and ever humble Christian. You know, verse number 24 of the previous chapter, of chapter number 9, verse 24 says this, know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize. So run that ye may obtain. Now, obviously, we all understand, I don't even need to explain to you, that unlike a race, Christians are not competing against other Christians, right? Chris, that's not how this works. You are, however, competing against yourself. You are competing against your flesh, and you are competing against all the obstacles and temptations the devil puts in your way. And there is no guarantee whatsoever that the Christian you is going to defeat the carnal you. Now, one day in the sky at the second coming, yes, on that day, it's guaranteed the Christian you would defeat the carnal you. But in the meantime, down here in the dirt, there's no guarantee. That's up to you. Look at the first half of verse 25 of chapter 9. And every man who striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Can I give you a good definition? I don't claim it's the end-all, be-all when it comes to definitions for the word temperance, but I want to give you what I think really gets to the gist of the matter. Being able to tell yourself no, that's temperance. Being able to tell yourself no. Being able to tell yourself no, even when it seems like something that's not so bad. And you would probably get away with it. And hardest of all, if you did it, no person around you would think anything of it. And you still are able to tell yourself no. That is temperance. Especially when you're talking about something that's not necessarily always because you may not, but you choose not for the greater good. That is temperance. See, The problem with always taking your liberty to the max is that what you're doing is you're seeing how close you can get to the edge without falling over. My friend, your overconfidence will be your downfall. However, your humility, knowing how weak you are, depending on God, being ever humble, that will be your salvation. Look at verse 27 of chapter 9. But I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest by any means, Paul says, lest by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. He knows he's not above being a castaway. Just because he's helped others rise in Christ is no guarantee he's going to end up not doing something wrong. So, for example, suppose with me that I am training for the Olympics. I'm getting in shape for the Olympics because I want to bring home a gold. Now, you offer me one chocolate chip cookie. Now here's my question. Here's my question. Would that one chocolate chip cookie necessarily cost me the gold? The answer to that, honestly, would be no. No, that one chocolate chip cookie by itself would not necessarily cost me the gold. That one single chocolate chip cookie could maybe end up being utterly inconsequential. But you see, a good athlete does one thing. He does not take victory for granted. And that's the key. He does not ever take victory for granted. And I am way overconfident if I believe that there is no way that that one chocolate chip cookie can't lead to a second chocolate chip cookie. See, seeing how many cookies you can eat and still bring home the gold is not a strategy for success. See? Can I say that again? Seeing how many cookies you can eat and still bring home the gold is not a strategy for success. How is it that a famous preacher, someone like that, could end up committing adultery? Because it's happened. How is it that a worldwide known preacher could commit adultery? I'll tell you this, he took victory for granted. He ended up committing adultery because he took for granted that he would never commit adultery. You know, I would sure like to think that I would be someone who would never, ever text while driving, right? I would like to think that I would never do that. I would like to think that I would never, ever endanger the lives of other people on the road by doing such a terrible thing as that. But let's say tomorrow I'm driving somewhere. Somebody texts me. I really want to text this person back. This person needs to be texted back, and I don't have any plans to pull over anytime soon. And it would be so convenient. I know I could do it. I've got a sharp mind. I'm sure I can pull it off. It'd be so convenient for me to do it. But I want to give you the three of the most dangerous words in the entire English language. The third of the three words is the word once. The first word is the word just. And the second word is the word this. Just this once are three of the most dangerous words in the entire English language. How many people are dead because of just this once? Because I know chances are nothing would happen, right? Chances are everything would be okay. But even if they were, the bigger problem still would be that I would be more likely to do it again. And I would become more and more confident in my ability to do it. And what would that equal? Me playing with more and more fire until it's going to catch up with me. You know, I once read something very wise on a fortune cookie. And the fortune cookie said this: if you never want anyone to find out, just don't do it. In verse 27, the Apostle Paul realizes his own potential to fail, because he says, lest by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. If an athlete doesn't stay in shape, he's off the team. And many Christians who started off being selfless, being sacrificial, and being disciplined, somewhere along the line, they made a choice one day to indulge in the flesh a little bit. Then they indulged more and more until the day came that you're out of shape and now you're off the team. I'm not talking about losing salvation at all. I'm talking about God's team of serving Him and bringing Him honor and glory. In verses 1 through 4 of chapter 10, we see the blessings that God gave to the ancient Israelites and how they allowed those blessings to go to their head. Because that's what we do, right? Somebody says, wow, you're doing great. We let it go to our head. God's blessings, sometimes we let them go to our head. Paul says in order to stay in the game, it's not enough to have been humble in the past. Stay in the game. You got to stay humble and you got to stay flexible. In other words, you got to stick with the attitude of, God, where am I getting off track? Show me where I am getting off track. Show me where I'm starting to mess up. Show me where I need to do better. Because a Christian who's not getting better is getting worse. Stay disciplined every day or end up being disqualified. You're not safe until you get to heaven. When you get to heaven, then you'll know, yeah, I think I'm doing pretty good. Until then, you're not, basically. Now, this is exactly, overconfidence is exactly what happened to the Old Testament Israelites. They disqualified themselves by floundering in their faith. They disqualified themselves by loosening their standards and basically seeing what they could get away with. Look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 10. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant, how that all our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So here Paul reminds his readers that the Israelites had everything going for them when they failed. They didn't fail when everything was going bad. They failed when everything was going good. You and I have even more going for us than they did. Now, verse number 1 refers to the fact that God parted the Red Sea, and God led them in the form of a cloud by day. And in verse 2, we are reminded that baptism represents the idea of identity. That through baptism you are identified with something, and then you're either blessed or cursed, depending on what that is that you are being identified with. So if you are being identified with something evil before God, take for example, taking the mark of the beast, okay, then that would be an example where you'd be cursed for that. But if you are identified with something good, then you're blessed for the sake of that which you are identified with. So they were blessed in Moses or because of Moses is the idea. See, even when God was not very pleased with them, He was typically a bit more pleased with Moses than He was with them. Well, guess what? You and I are infinitely more blessed for the sake of Christ than they were ever for the sake of Moses, because God is infinitely more pleased with His own Son than He ever was with any other man, including Moses. So the Israelites forgot that all of God's sustenance and care, they forgot that it was all in spite of them, not because of them. They acted as if God owed them something, when God owes us Absolutely nothing. We have no negotiating leverage with God. None whatsoever. And we become overconfident, and we take for granted that God is going to just continue to bless us in spite of whatever shenanigans we choose to pull. It is necessary sometimes for God to pull the rug out from under our feet in order to humble us. It is necessary for God to pull the rug out from under our feet to remind us that if we want to stay blessed, then we have to stay sharp and we have to stay godly. Verses 3 and 4 remind us that it has always been Christ, and it has always been Christ alone. God the Father has never acted any other way than through his Son. Through Christ, God created the earth. And through Christ, God took care of the Israelites in the wilderness. Look at verses 3 and 4. And did all eat the same spiritual meat, and did all drink the same spiritual drink? For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Okay, how many times do these verses use the word spiritual? Right? Spiritual, spiritual, spiritual. And yet, the drink was a literal drink. It was water, right? So it's literal water. The food was literal food. The rock was a literal rock. But the point, though, the point of all these physical blessings was to point us to the spiritual reality of Christ. See, to take the food that God has provided and use it against God. How do we use food against God? By expending the energy that we derived from the food to disobey him. Well, that's nothing short of stealing, isn't it? Christians get off track when Christians become unthankful. God gives us food to keep us humble so we can be reminded every time we eat, we thank God for this meal. We don't take for granted. God gave us all these other meals, but we're not guaranteed today's meal. We're not guaranteed tomorrow's meal. So food and praying before food, thanking God for food, is meant to be an ever-continuous reminder that we are continually dependent upon his goodness. See, the secret to never getting overconfident and then we mess it all up, the key to avoiding that is this: stay begging. Stay begging. That's it. Stay begging every day. Because if there's anything I were to say today that you might want to write down or maybe put it on a bumper sticker or something like that, here are the words. It's hard to fall when you're on your knees. It's hard to fall when you're on your knees. And the Israelites took God's approval for granted, and therefore they lost God's approval. Verses 5 and 6. But with many of them, God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. So the problem with the Israelites was this: they felt entitled. And the same sense of entitlement will take root in us as well if we do not exercise the discipline of staying thankful, staying on our knees, staying humble, and staying in a state of begging God. First, we see idolatry in verse 7. Neither be ye idolaters, as some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, idolatry is not necessarily bowing down to a statue. It is when you create an image of God, not out of stone, but you fashion a new version of God in your mind. When you make God as you want him to be, rather than as he is. When you say, well, I don't think God has any problem with that. I think God's okay with us doing this, and I think God's hunky-dory with us doing that. Okay. Where did you get a God who's okay with that? Did you get him out of the Bible? Or did you get a God who's okay with that out of your mind? Did you fashion a God after your own image in your mind? Verse 7 refers to Exodus chapter 32, where the Israelites make the golden calf. So eat and drink is a reference to excessive feasting and to drunkenness. And then the words rose up to play, that refers to sexual relations. The most persuasive false god is always the god of sexual liberation. The god of sexual desire has always been the most popular idol in any pagan society. So also do people today want to alter God's standards for sexuality. They desire to do that more than they desire to alter any other aspect of God's authority. Verse 8, neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Feeling entitled to God's approval, being overconfident, led to idolatry, which led to fornication, which led to God's judgment. Verse 9 tells us that they thought they had the right to demand better. Verse 9, neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed of serpents. So tempting God is when a Christian says, God, either you do this for me or I won't do that for you. That's tempting God. Trying to make a deal. God, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. I'll do this for you if you do that for me. God has provided. But rather than being thankful, instead the Israelites wanted to see what more they could get out of him and what they could get away with. Like someone who says, oh, I would go to church, or I would serve God if things were different, if I had a more comfortable life, if I had more money or I had better health. I'm not talking about what you can't do. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what you're willing to do. Oh, I would live for God. I would do this. I would do that if things were different. You know what? No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. If you won't do right where you are, neither would you do right if you were over there. You're just trying to get more out of God before you will honor him. And so in verse 10, they griped. Neither murmur ye. That means gripe and complain. As some of them murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. It's very important for us to understand there's a big difference between complaining and mourning or hurting. That's not complaining. But when it comes to complaining, we have no right to complain about what God gives us. Hey, God, you can do better than this. What's the matter with you, huh? The reason we have no right to complain is because God owes us nothing. But a Christian who does not stay disciplined in the fine art of humility and thankfulness is going to become an entitled little brat. Verse 11 tells us that the example of the Israelites is for us here and now. Look at verses 11, 12, and 13. And now all these things happened unto them for ensamples, that means examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Wherefore, we go back to where we started, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed, lest he fall. Verse 13, there hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will, with the temptation, also make a way of escape, that ye may be able to bear it. The next verse is going to tell us to flee from idolatry, meaning run from idolatry as fast as you can. So the point is this: take temptation seriously. Oh, I can resist any temptation. Temptation's no big deal. Temptation ain't got nothing on me. I'm bulletproof. I'm unsinkable. I'm unstoppable. I'm awesome. The point is to take temptation seriously. Be scared to death that you could fail. Be scared to death that you could fail. You cannot become fascinated by sin and put yourself in the place of temptation, and then after you chose to go there and make decision after decision, but then, don't worry, at the last moment, God will deliver me. You can't play God that way. When it comes to words like escape or flee, you want to know what I am so reminded of? Boy, am I reminded of Joseph and that encounter with Potiphar's wife. When Potiphar's wife grabbed a hold of his garment and said, "Lie with me," what did Joseph do? He hightailed it out of there, is what he did. That was the right thing for him to do. Now let's compare that to King David and how King David handled somewhat of a similar situation. King David committed adultery with Bathsheba because he felt entitled and he was overconfident. He stepped out onto his balcony, saw Bathsheba taking a bath. I don't know if that's why her name was Bathsheba. I don't know, but that's what he saw her doing, and he would not let it go. Could have been the end of it. But no, he decided to inquire. "Servant, come here. Do you know who that woman is?" And that guy told him, "That's the wife of Uriah the Hittite," as if to say, she's not available. David didn't take the hint. Now, here's the thing. God gave David a way of escape. And here's what it was: shut the blinds. That was the only, think of how easy it would have been. I mean, maybe internally difficult, but physically so easy. All he had to do was shut the blinds. So, to go back to the Olympic illustration, don't just get in shape. You have to stay in shape, stay disciplined, and stay sharp. Now let's go back to David for a minute. 2 Samuel chapter number 11 tells us that wasn't the very first step he made to get off track. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, it was really time for David to leave the palace and go off to battle. But in his sense of entitlement, I think I've done a lot, David decided to play hooky. David stayed home on a workday. He stayed home on a workday for no real good reason. Now, would that in and of itself have been the end of the world, staying home on a workday? Well, of course not. But no decision happens in a vacuum. Every decision gets you closer to some other decision. He decided to stay home on a workday. That's what put him there, to see Bathsheba and to lust after her. It all started with one chocolate chip cookie. Will that one little chocolate chip cookie by itself cost you the gold? No. Staying home on a one little work day, playing hooky, not the end of the world. But we see the failure of King David. That every choice you make to indulge the flesh, even a tiny, innocent-looking little bit, is only going to lead nowhere other than to indulging the flesh more and more. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8 says, "Be sober and be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walketh about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, even on your day off. Pride and overconfidence cloud our judgment, and they make us no longer vigilant, and they make us no longer sober. And the moment you're off your game and no longer humble, the devil will be all over that. See, a little bit of fear is a good thing. We should be afraid of blowing it. Good men fall because they thought they were incapable of blowing it. Good men who do not fall succeed because they never took victory for granted. And so they stayed at their best, and they stayed close to God. At this time, the musicians will come. In just a moment, we're going to have our hymn of invitation. This morning, if you wish to maintain a disciplined Christian life where you stay as far away from sin and pride as you possibly can, because you don't take victory for granted, and so you stay begging at the feet of Jesus, knowing how easily you could fail, but through him you can succeed, and only through him, and you stay dependent on him. If that's the decision, that's the state of your heart that you want to give to God this morning, then as we rise to our feet and sing this hymn together, you come forward.